Welcome back to the Historian's Tome. Before we begin tonight's journey through ancient Persia, take a moment to get comfortable. Adjust your pillows, settle into your favorite sleeping position, and let the weight of the day fall away. If you're enjoying these historical sleep stories, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel. It really helps us continue creating these peaceful journeys through time.
I'm curious, where in the world are you watching from tonight?
What time is it there? Are you winding down after a long day, or perhaps drifting off in the early morning hours? Whatever time it is, you're exactly where you need to be. Tonight, we'll explore the rise and fall of one of history's greatest empires. So close your eyes, breathe deeply, and let's begin. Long before the Persian Empire became the greatest power the ancient world had ever seen, the land of Persia was home to simple farming communities and nomadic tribes. These people lived in the region we now call Iran, surrounded by mountains and deserts that shaped their hardy character. The story of how these scattered groups became rulers of the known world is one of ambition, strategy, and remarkable leadership. The Persian people belonged to a larger group called the Indo-Europeans, who had migrated to this region many centuries before our story begins. They settled in the highlands east of Mesopotamia, that fertile land between two rivers where civilization first bloomed. The Persians were related to another group called the Medes, who initially held more power in the region. For many years, the Persians lived under the shadow of Median rule, paying tribute and following the commands of Median kings. In the 6th century before the Common Era, a young man named Cyrus was born into the ruling family of a small Persian kingdom called Anshan. The stories say that his grandfather, the Median king Astyages, had a troubling dream about the boy. In this dream, a great vine grew from his daughter and spread across all of Asia. The court priests who interpreted dreams warned that this meant the child would one day overthrow him. Like many ancient tales, this one involves an attempt to kill the baby, a kind shepherd who saved him, and a destiny that could not be avoided. Whether or not these legends are completely true, we know that Cyrus grew up to become an extraordinary leader. Around 559 BCE, he became the king of Anshan. The young ruler was intelligent, brave, and possessed a gift for winning the loyalty of others. He looked at the Median Empire that ruled over his people and saw not an unbeatable power, but an opportunity. The Median king Astyages, his grandfather in the old stories, had become unpopular with his own people through harsh rule and poor decisions. Cyrus began to quietly build alliances. He reached out to other Persian tribes and to dissatisfied Median nobles. He treated people with respect and made promises he intended to keep. This approach would become his signature style throughout his life. In 553 BCE, Cyrus openly rebelled against Median rule. What followed was not a long, drawn-out war, but a relatively swift victory. Many Median soldiers, unhappy with their own king, simply switched sides. The Median general Harpagus, whom Astyages had wronged years before, brought his entire army over to Cyrus. By 550 BCE, Cyrus had captured the Median capital of Ecbatana. But here is where Cyrus showed the wisdom that would make him different from other conquerors. Instead of destroying the Median people or treating them as defeated enemies, he incorporated them into his new empire as equals. Medes received important positions in government and the army. This policy of tolerance and inclusion would become a cornerstone of Persian imperial strategy. With the Median territories under his control, Cyrus now ruled a significant power, but he had bigger ambitions. To the west lay the wealthy kingdom of Lydia, in what is now Turkey. Its king, Croesus, was famous throughout the ancient world for his incredible wealth. Gold from Lydian mines had made Croesus so rich that his name became synonymous with fortune.
Even today, we say someone is as rich as Croesus, king. Croesus heard about the rise of Cyrus with concern.
He consulted the oracle at Delphi, that mysterious priestess who spoke prophecies in Greece. The oracle told him that if he attacked Persia, he would destroy a great empire. Encouraged by this prophecy, Croesus gathered his armies and marched east in 547 BCE, but prophecies can be tricky things. Croesus did indeed destroy a great empire, but it was his own, not Cyrus's. The war between Lydia and Persia showcased Cyrus's tactical brilliance. When the two armies first met, the battle was inconclusive. Croesus retreated to his capital at Sardis, planning to gather more allies over the winter before fighting again in the spring. This was the normal pattern of ancient warfare. Armies rarely campaigned in winter, but Cyrus understood that doing the unexpected often leads to victory. Instead of returning home, he immediately pursued Croesus to Sardis. The Lydian army was famous for its cavalry, soldiers mounted on horses. In the coming battle, Cyrus needed to neutralize this advantage. He came up with a clever solution. Cyrus gathered all the camels that had been carrying supplies for his army. He placed soldiers on these camels and put them at the front of his battle line. When the Lydian horses smelled the unfamiliar camels and heard their strange sounds, they panicked and refused to charge. The Lydian cavalry was thrown into chaos, and the Persian infantry won the day. Sardis fell after a short siege.
Once again, Cyrus showed mercy to the defeated.
When his soldiers were about to kill Croesus, Cyrus stopped them. He treated the former king with respect and even made him an advisor. This act of clemency impressed people throughout the region. A conqueror who spared defeated kings was unusual in that brutal age. Now Cyrus turned his attention to the greatest prize of all, Babylon. This ancient city in Mesopotamia was the jewel of the Near East. Its massive walls were considered impregnable. Its hanging gardens were counted among the wonders of the world, and its temples held unimaginable wealth. The Babylonian Empire controlled much of what we now call Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon. It was ruled by Nabonidus, a king more interested in archaeology and religion than in governing effectively. The conquest of Babylon in 539 BCE was Cyrus's masterpiece. Rather than attacking the mighty walls directly, he diverted the Euphrates River, which flowed under the walls and through the city. When the water level dropped, Persian soldiers waded along the riverbed and entered Babylon through the water gates. The city fell with minimal fighting. Some ancient sources claim the gates were actually opened from inside by citizens who preferred Persian rule to that of Nabonidus. Once again, Cyrus's treatment of the conquered showed his genius. He entered Babylon not as a foreign invader, but as a liberator. He made sacrifices to the Babylonian gods and restored temples that Nabonidus had neglected. He freed people who had been enslaved or deported by previous Babylonian kings. Among these freed people were the Jews, who had been held captive in Babylon for decades. Cyrus allowed them to return to Jerusalem and even funded the rebuilding of their temple. For this act, he is remembered with honor in Jewish history and is even called the Messiah, the Anointed One in the Hebrew Bible. Cyrus created something new in world history. A multicultural, multi-religious empire that allowed different peoples to keep their own customs and beliefs. Previous empires had tried to dominate and assimilate conquered peoples. Cyrus understood that people would be more loyal if they felt respected. He presented himself not as the king of Persia ruling over foreign subjects, but as the legitimate ruler of each region according to its own traditions. In Babylon, he was the king of Babylon. In Persia, he was the king of Persia. This flexible approach to imperial rule was revolutionary. The empire Cyrus built stretched from the Mediterranean Sea to Central Asia. It included dozens of different peoples speaking different languages and following different customs. Yet it held together because of the system Cyrus established. He divided the empire into provinces called satrapies, each ruled by a governor called a satrap. These governors had significant local power but reported to the king. A system of royal inspectors, known as the eyes and ears of the king, traveled throughout the empire to make sure the satraps remained loyal. Cyrus died in 530 BCE, fighting nomadic tribes on the eastern frontier of his empire. Various stories tell of his death, but most agree he died in battle, always the warrior, even in old age. He was buried in a simple tomb in Pasargadae, the city he had founded. The tomb still stands today, a modest stone structure that bears an inscription said to have read, "I am Cyrus, king of the world. Begrudge me not this monument." The empire Cyrus left behind was the largest the world had yet seen. But more than its size, what made it remarkable was its organization and its relative tolerance. Cyrus had shown that an empire could be held together through respect and good governance, not just fear and violence. His legacy would shape the Persian Empire for the next 2 centuries and influence ideas about kingship and empire for millennia to come. After the death of Cyrus the Great, his son Cambyses became king. Cambyses was an able military leader but lacked his father's gift for winning hearts and minds. His greatest achievement was the conquest of Egypt in 525 BCE. Egypt was one of the oldest and most powerful civilizations in the world, and bringing it into the Persian Empire was a significant accomplishment. The conquest of Egypt began with careful preparation. Cambyses secured alliances with Arab tribes who controlled the desert routes. He hired Greek mercenaries to strengthen his army. When he marched into Egypt, he was ready for the challenges of fighting in that unique land. The decisive battle took place at Pelusium, near the mouth of the Nile River. The Egyptian army fought bravely, but the Persians were too strong. Egypt became a Persian province and Cambyses became pharaoh. However, Cambyses made the mistake of not following his father's example of respecting local customs. Ancient historians, admittedly mostly Greek and therefore potentially biased, claim he insulted Egyptian religion and traditions. Whether these stories are entirely true or exaggerated, it is clear that his rule in Egypt was less successful than his conquest of it. He attempted further campaigns into Nubia and against Carthage, but these ended in failure. In 522 BCE, while Cambyses was still in Egypt, troubling news came from Persia. A man claiming to be Cambyses' younger brother Bardia had seized the throne. Cambyses rushed back toward Persia but died on the way, possibly by his own hand, possibly from an infected wound. The circumstances remain mysterious. What happened next was one of the most dramatic succession crises in ancient history. A group of 7 Persian nobles, led by a man named Darius, claimed that the person on the throne was not really Bardia, but an impostor, a priest who looked like the prince. According to their account, Cambyses had secretly killed his brother before going to Egypt, and this priest had taken advantage of the situation. The 7 nobles stormed the palace and killed the man they called the false Bardia. After some discussion about what form of government would be best, the nobles decided to keep the monarchy. They agreed that the one whose horse neighed first at dawn would become king. Darius, or perhaps his clever groom, won this contest and Darius became the new king. Modern historians debate what really happened during these events. Did Darius and his fellow conspirators truly expose an impostor? Or did they overthrow the legitimate king and invent a story to justify their actions? We cannot know for certain. What we do know is that Darius proved to be one of the greatest rulers in history. When Darius took power, the empire was on the verge of falling apart. Rebellions broke out across the realm as different regions saw the succession crisis as an opportunity for independence. Darius spent the first 2 years of his reign fighting no fewer than 19 battles against rebels and pretenders. He won them all. To commemorate his victories and legitimize his rule, Darius created the famous Behistun inscription, a massive carving on a cliff face telling his version of events in 3 languages: Old Persian, Babylonian, and Elamite. Once he had secured his throne, Darius set about reorganizing the empire. If Cyrus was the founder and conqueror, Darius was the administrator and builder. He took the systems Cyrus had created and refined them into a sophisticated government structure. He reorganized the satrapies, making their borders and responsibilities clearer. He established a regular system of taxation based on the resources of each province. Some paid in silver, others in goods like horses or exotic products. Darius created a standardized coinage system throughout the empire. The gold coin, called the Daric, named after Darius himself, became a standard of value across the known world. This common currency made trade much easier and helped bind the empire together economically. Darius also established a system of weights and measures to facilitate commerce. Perhaps Darius's most impressive achievement was the creation
of the Royal Road. This was a highway stretching over
500 miles from Sardis in the west to Susa in the heart of the empire. The road had stations at regular intervals where royal messengers could get fresh horses. A message that previously might have taken months to travel from one end of the empire to the other could now be delivered in a week. The Greek historian Herodotus wrote admiringly that neither snow nor rain nor heat nor gloom of night stayed these Persian couriers from the swift completion of their appointed rounds. Centuries later, this phrase would be adapted as an unofficial motto for postal services. Darius was also a great builder. He constructed a magnificent new capital at Persepolis, a city designed to showcase the power and glory of the Persian Empire. Persepolis was built on a massive stone terrace carved from a mountain. Its grand staircases were adorned with carvings showing representatives from all parts of the empire, bringing tribute to the king. The palace buildings featured massive columns and elaborate decorations. Every spring, people from across the empire would gather at Persepolis to celebrate Nowruz, the Persian New Year, and to reaffirm their loyalty to the king. Darius also completed a canal linking the Nile River to the Red Sea, an early version of the Suez Canal. He sponsored exploration voyages, sending expeditions to investigate trade routes and distant lands. Under his rule, the Persian Empire reached its peak of organization and efficiency. But Darius also faced challenges, particularly in the west. The Greek cities on the coast of what is now Turkey were part of the Persian Empire, but they chafed under Persian rule. In 499 BCE, these cities rebelled, starting what became known as the Ionian Revolt. The rebels received some help from Athens and Eretria, two Greek city-states across the Aegean Sea. The Persians eventually crushed the revolt by 493 BCE, but Darius did not forget that Athens and Eretria had interfered in his empire. In 492 BCE, Darius sent an expedition to punish the Greeks who had aided the rebels. The expedition met with mixed success and was hampered by a storm that destroyed many ships. 2 years later, in 490 BCE, Darius sent another force directly across the Aegean Sea. This army landed at Marathon, a plain northeast of Athens. What happened next became one of the most famous battles in history. The Athenians, though vastly outnumbered, marched out to meet the Persian force. In a brilliant tactical move, they strengthened their flanks and deliberately weakened their center. When the battle began, the Persian troops pushed forward in the center, thinking they were winning. But the strong Athenian flanks wrapped around and caught the Persians in a trap. The Persian army broke and fled to their ships. The Greeks had won an unlikely and celebrated victory. The Battle of Marathon did not seriously damage Persian power, but it had enormous psychological impact. The Greeks had proven that the mighty Persian army could be beaten. For Athens, Marathon became a defining moment in their history. Even today, we remember it every time a marathon race is run, commemorating the run of the messenger who brought news of victory to Athens. Darius began preparing for a massive invasion to conquer Greece once and for all, but he died in 486 BCE before these plans could be carried out. The task would fall to his son, Xerxes. Xerxes inherited a vast and powerful empire from his father. Modern historians sometimes portray him as less capable than Darius, but this may be unfair. Xerxes faced the difficult task of following one of history's greatest rulers. He dealt competently with a rebellion in Egypt at the start of his reign and later suppressed a revolt in Babylon. But Xerxes is remembered primarily for his invasion of Greece. He spent 4 years preparing a massive expedition. The Persian army that marched west in 480 BCE was the largest military force ever assembled up to that point in history. The Greek historian Herodotus claimed it numbered over 1 million men, but modern scholars think the real number was probably between 150,000 and 300,000. Still enormous by ancient standards, Xerxes built a bridge of boats across the Hellespont, the narrow strait separating Asia from Europe. When a storm destroyed the first bridge, Xerxes reportedly ordered the sea to be whipped as punishment, a story that may be Greek propaganda, but illustrates how the Greeks viewed Persian power as arrogant. A second, stronger bridge was built, and the Persian army crossed into Europe. The invasion initially went well. The Greeks tried to stop the Persians at Thermopylae, a narrow pass between the mountains and the sea. A small Greek force led by the Spartan king Leonidas held the pass for 3 days against the entire Persian army. Eventually, a local Greek traitor showed the Persians a mountain path around the pass. Realizing they would be surrounded, most of the Greek force retreated, but Leonidas and his 300 Spartans stayed to cover the retreat. They fought to the last man in a last stand that became legendary. With Thermopylae taken, the way to Athens was open. The Athenians evacuated their city, and the Persians burned it to the ground. It seemed the conquest of Greece was nearly complete. But the Athenian navy, urged on by the leader Themistocles, lured the Persian fleet into the narrow straits near the island of Salamis. In these confined waters, the larger Persian fleet could not maneuver effectively. The Greeks smashed the Persian navy in a stunning victory. Without naval support, the Persian army in Greece was vulnerable. Xerxes returned to Persia, leaving his general Mardonius with a large force to continue the campaign. The next year, the combined Greek armies met this Persian force at Plataea. The Greeks won decisively, and Mardonius was killed. On the same day, according to tradition, the Greeks also won a naval victory at Mycale on the coast of Asia Minor. The Persian invasion of Greece had failed. For the Persians, it was a setback, but not a disaster. The Greek cities of Asia Minor remained under Persian control, and the empire's core territories were untouched. But for the Greeks, these victories became central to their identity. They had faced the might of the world's greatest empire and survived. Xerxes ruled for another 14 years after the Greek campaigns. He built extensively at Persepolis and continued his father's administrative work. But in 465 BCE, he was assassinated in a palace conspiracy, murdered in his own bedroom by the commander of his guard. The circumstances suggest a power struggle involving his son Artaxerxes. After the dramatic reigns of Cyrus, Darius, and Xerxes, the Persian Empire entered a longer, quieter period. The kings who followed are less famous to us today, but their reigns are no less important to the story. This was when the empire matured from an expanding conquest state into an established civilization with its own culture and character. Artaxerxes I, who ruled from 465 to 424 BCE, spent much of his reign dealing with revolts in Egypt and troubles with Greece. The Athenians, emboldened by their earlier victories, sent an expedition to support Egyptian rebels. This campaign ultimately failed, but it showed that Persia faced ongoing challenges maintaining control over distant provinces. Eventually, Artaxerxes made peace with Athens in 449 BCE. This Peace of Callias, as historians call it, essentially recognized a stalemate. Persia would not attack Greece, and Greece would not interfere in Persian territory. During this period, life in the Persian Empire settled into patterns that would last for generations. The empire was incredibly diverse, stretching from India to Egypt, from the Arabian deserts to the steppes of Central Asia. Within its borders lived Persians, Medes, Babylonians, Egyptians, Jews, Phoenicians, Greeks, and dozens of other peoples. They spoke different languages, worshipped different gods, and followed different customs. Yet, all were subjects of the Persian king. The Persian system of government allowed this diversity to flourish. Local rulers often remained in place, governing their own people according to traditional laws. They sent tribute to the Persian king and provided soldiers when needed, but otherwise enjoyed considerable autonomy. This practical approach to empire was far more sustainable than trying to force everyone to become Persian. The official language of the empire was Aramaic, a Semitic language that was already widely used for trade and diplomacy. Using Aramaic rather than Persian as the imperial language was another example of Persian pragmatism. Government documents were written in Aramaic and sent throughout the empire. Local officials would translate them into whatever language their people spoke. The religion of the Persian rulers was Zoroastrianism, named after the prophet Zoroaster, who had lived some time before the empire began. Zoroastrians believed in one supreme god, Ahura Mazda, who was locked in an eternal struggle against Angra Mainyu, the spirit of evil and chaos. Humans had to choose which side to support through their thoughts, words, and deeds. Good thoughts, good words, and good deeds were the foundation of Zoroastrian ethics. However, the Persian kings did not force their religion on others. In fact, they often supported the temples and priests of other religions within their empire. This religious tolerance was unusual in the ancient world. While conquered peoples had to acknowledge the political authority of the Persian king, they could worship their own gods without interference. This policy created loyalty and reduced the chance of religiously motivated rebellions. Life at the Persian court was formal and elaborate. The king was surrounded by ceremony and protocol that emphasized his supreme power. Visitors had to prostrate themselves before him, a practice the Greeks found humiliating but which was normal in Persian culture. The king had many wives and concubines housed in a separate part of the palace. His mother, called the Queen Mother, often wielded significant influence. The king was supported by an elaborate bureaucracy of officials, scribes, and advisors. The most important official was the Hazarapatis, the commander of the guard, and often the power behind the throne. Court intrigues and conspiracies were common. Several Persian kings died by assassination, victims of plots hatched within their own palaces. Despite the dangers of court life, being part of the Persian elite had many rewards. The king rewarded loyal service with grants of land, expensive gifts, and positions of honor. Persian nobles lived in luxury with fine clothes, elaborate jewelry, and households full of servants. They hunted in royal game parks, hosted lavish banquets, and competed to display their wealth and status. The empire's economy was based primarily on agriculture. The fertile plains of Mesopotamia, the Nile Valley of Egypt, and the highland valleys of Iran produced wheat, barley, and other crops that fed the empire's population. Irrigation systems, some dating back thousands of years, brought water to fields. Farmers paid taxes to support the king and his government. Trade was also vital to the empire's prosperity. Merchants traveled the royal road and other routes carrying goods from one end of the empire to the other. From India came spices, cotton, and precious stones. From Arabia came incense and perfumes. The Greek cities produced wine, olive oil, and manufactured goods. Egypt supplied grain. The Phoenician cities were centers of trade and manufacturing, producing the famous purple dye made from sea snails. The Persians were famous for their artistic achievements, particularly in metalwork and weaving. Persian craftsmen made beautiful gold and silver vessels, bowls, plates, and drinking cups. They wove carpets and textiles that were prized throughout the ancient world. The ruins of Persian palaces show walls decorated with glazed brick panels in bright colors, depicting lions, bulls, and mythical creatures. The years following Artaxerxes, I saw several short reigns and succession disputes. Xerxes too ruled for only 45 days before being murdered by his half-brother. His half-brother ruled for a few months before being overthrown by another half-brother, Darius II, who managed to hold power from 423 to 404 BCE. These dynastic struggles weakened the empire but did not break it. During this period, Persia involved itself in Greek affairs once more. When Athens and Sparta went to war with each other in the Great Peloponnesian War, Persia saw an opportunity. By providing money and ships to Sparta, the Persians helped ensure Athens' defeat in 404 BCE. This intervention restored Persian influence in the Greek world and demonstrated that Persia remained a major power despite its earlier setbacks in Greece. Artaxerxes I, who ruled from 404 to 358 BCE, had one of the longest reigns in Persian history. His rule began with a challenge from his younger brother Cyrus, not the great Cyrus, but a prince who shared his name. This younger Cyrus recruited an army that included 10,000 Greek mercenaries and marched against his brother. The two armies met at Cunaxa near Babylon in 401 BCE. Cyrus was killed in the battle, and his rebellion collapsed. The Greek mercenaries who had fought for Cyrus found themselves stranded deep in the Persian Empire. Their long march home, described in the book Anabasis by Xenophon, one of their commanders, became one of the great adventure stories of ancient literature. Their journey showed both the vast size of the Persian Empire and the difficulties of controlling such a huge territory. Artaxerxes II faced other challenges during his long reign. Egypt rebelled and achieved independence for several decades. There were revolts in various provinces, yet the empire held together. The administrative systems established by Darius continued to function. Trade flourished. The satrapy system, despite occasional corruption and disloyalty, kept the provinces under control. The reign of Artaxerxes III, from 358 to 338 BCE, saw a revival of Persian military power. He reconquered Egypt in 343 BCE, ending its period of independence. He dealt harshly with rebellious satraps and restored central authority. But Artaxerxes III was murdered by a court eunuch named Bagoas, who then poisoned Artaxerxes' son after a brief reign. Bagoas placed a distant relative of the royal family, Darius III, on the throne. This Darius would be the last king of the Persian Empire, though he could not have known it when he took power in 336 BCE. When Darius III became king in 336 BCE, the Persian Empire was still the dominant power in the Near East. It had stood for over 2 centuries. Its wealth was legendary, its armies still formidable, and its territory vast. But far to the west, a storm was gathering that would sweep away this ancient empire in just a few short years. In the kingdom of Macedon, on the northern fringe of the Greek world, a young king named Alexander had recently come to power. His father, Philip II, had transformed Macedon from a backward kingdom into the dominant power in Greece. Philip had planned to invade the Persian Empire to liberate the Greek cities of Asia Minor and to plunder the legendary wealth of Persia. But Philip was assassinated at his daughter's wedding in 336 BCE, the same year Darius III took the Persian throne. Alexander was only 20 years old when he became king. Many expected him to be too young and inexperienced to hold his father's empire together, but Alexander quickly proved himself. He crushed rebellions in Greece and secured his northern borders. Then, in 334 BCE, he crossed into Asia with an army of about 35,000 Macedonians and Greeks to carry out his father's planned invasion of Persia. Darius III was not particularly worried by this invasion. The Greeks had invaded Persian territory before and been driven back. He sent a regional force to deal with what he assumed was a minor incursion. These forces met Alexander at the Granicus River in northwestern Turkey. Alexander personally led a cavalry charge across the river and up the opposite bank, a move so reckless that he nearly died. But his courage inspired his men, and the Macedonians won the battle. The Greek cities of Western Asia Minor opened their gates to Alexander. As Alexander moved south along the coast, Darius began to realize this invasion was more serious than he had thought. In the autumn of 333 BCE, Darius personally led a large army to confront the invader. The two armies met at Issus, a narrow plain between the mountains and the sea. Darius had the larger army, but Alexander had positioned himself in a place where numbers were less important. The Battle of Issus was intense and hard fought. Alexander again led a cavalry charge, this time directly at the position of Darius himself. As the Macedonian cavalry broke through the Persian lines and approached the royal chariot, Darius panicked and fled. With their king in flight, the Persian army broke and ran. Darius left behind his wife, his mother, and his children, all of whom were captured by Alexander. He also left his royal tent, full of luxuries that amazed the Macedonians. Alexander treated the captured royal family with great respect, a gesture that won him admiration even among his enemies. After Issus, Alexander turned south. Instead of pursuing Darius immediately, he spent the next 2 years conquering the eastern Mediterranean coast. This decision made strategic sense. These coastal cities were the bases for the Persian fleet, and by capturing them, Alexander neutralized Persian naval power. The cities of Phoenicia fell one by one. The island city of Tyre held out for 7 months before Alexander built a causeway to it and took it by storm. Egypt, which had been restless under Persian rule, welcomed Alexander as a liberator. While in Egypt, he founded the city of Alexandria, which would become one of the great cities of the ancient world. He visited the oracle of Zeus Ammon in the desert, and rumors spread that the oracle had confirmed Alexander was the son of a god. Whether Alexander truly believed this or simply found it politically useful is debated, but he did not discourage such talk. By 331 BCE, Alexander was ready to march into the heart of the Persian Empire. Darius had spent these 2 years gathering a massive army from all corners of his realm. The two forces met on the plain of Gaugamela, near the ancient city of Nineveh. Darius had chosen the battlefield carefully, ensuring it was wide and flat, perfect for his chariots and cavalry. The Battle of Gaugamela was the decisive encounter between the two empires. Darius's army may have outnumbered Alexander's by as much as 3 to 1. The battle began before dawn. Darius sent his scythed chariots charging at the Macedonian lines, but Alexander's men simply opened gaps in their formation and let the chariots race through harmlessly. Then Alexander led his cavalry in a charge, once again aiming directly at Darius. The fighting was fierce. At one point, a gap opened in the Macedonian line, and Persian troops poured through, reaching Alexander's camp. But Alexander kept his focus on Darius. As the Macedonian cavalry approached the Persian king for the second time, Darius once again lost his nerve and fled the battlefield. With their king gone, the Persian army collapsed. This time, Darius fled east, deeper into his empire. Alexander pursued, but Darius stayed ahead of him. The Persian king hoped to raise new armies in the eastern provinces and continue the fight. But the empire was crumbling. After Gaugamela, the great cities opened their gates to Alexander. Babylon welcomed him with celebrations. Susa surrendered without a fight, handing over its vast treasuries. Alexander next marched on Persepolis, the ceremonial capital built by Darius the Great. He captured the city and seized its treasures, which were so vast it took thousands of mules and camels to carry them away. Some months later, whether by accident or design, the great palace of Persepolis burned down. Some sources say Alexander ordered it burned in revenge for the Persian burning of Athens 150 years earlier.
Others say the fire started during a drunken party.
The ruins of Persepolis still stand today, a reminder of vanished glory. As Alexander moved deeper into Persia, Darius retreated before him. The great king, who had ruled the mightiest empire on earth, was now a fugitive in his own lands. Several of his satraps and generals began to see him as a liability. If Darius were gone, perhaps they could make terms with Alexander. In the summer of 330 BCE, a group of Persian nobles led by the satrap Bessus attacked Darius as he fled east. They left him dying by the roadside. When Alexander's forces arrived shortly after, Darius was dead or dying. Alexander reportedly wept when he saw his fallen enemy and ordered that Darius be given a royal burial. With Darius dead, Alexander considered himself the legitimate king of Persia, but large parts of the Eastern Empire had not yet submitted. Alexander spent the next 3 years campaigning in what are now Iran, Afghanistan, and Central Asia. Bessus, who had killed Darius, proclaimed himself the new king, but Alexander hunted him down and executed him for treason. The fighting in these eastern provinces was difficult, with harsh terrain and fierce resistance. Alexander founded cities to secure his conquests, many of them named Alexandria. In these campaigns, Alexander began to adopt Persian customs and dress. He wore Persian royal robes on occasion and expected people to bow before him in the Persian manner. He married Roxana, a princess from Bactria in modern Afghanistan. These actions troubled his Macedonian companions, who felt Alexander was abandoning Greek ways. Some plots against Alexander were discovered and harshly punished. In a drunken rage, Alexander killed one of his oldest friends who had criticized him. By 327 BCE, Alexander had secured the eastern provinces. He then invaded India, crossing the Indus River and defeating local rulers. His men were amazed by the war elephants used by Indian armies. At the Hydaspes River, Alexander won a hard-fought battle against King Porus, who commanded a force that included 200 elephants. Alexander's men fought brilliantly in the monsoon rain, but the battle was costly. After the Hydaspes, Alexander wanted to push deeper into India, but his men had been campaigning for 8 years. They were far from home, exhausted, and wanted to return. At the Bees River, the army refused to go farther. For the first time, Alexander had to give in to his men's wishes. Reluctantly, he agreed to turn back. The return journey was brutal. Part of the army traveled by ship down the Indus River and along the coast. The rest, led by Alexander, marched through the Gedrosian Desert, one of the harshest environments on Earth. Thousands died of thirst and heat. It was perhaps the costliest mistake of Alexander's career. When the various parts of his army finally reunited in Persia, Alexander discovered that many of his governors had abused their power, assuming he would never return. He executed the worst offenders and tried to restore order to his vast conquests. Alexander settled in Babylon, which he intended to make the capital of his empire. He planned new campaigns to Arabia and perhaps to the Western Mediterranean. He organized a mass wedding where thousands of his soldiers married Persian women, hoping to blend the Macedonian and Persian peoples. He recruited Persian soldiers into his army to the displeasure of his Macedonian veterans. Alexander had conquered the Persian Empire, but now he wanted to truly unite East and West. But in June 323 BCE, after a night of heavy drinking, Alexander fell ill with a fever. For 10 days he grew steadily worse. His men filed past his bed to see him one last time. On June 10th or 11th, 323 BCE, Alexander died. He was not quite 33 years old. When asked on his deathbed who should inherit his empire, Alexander reportedly said, "To the strongest." These words, if he truly spoke them, proved prophetic. Alexander's death plunged his empire into chaos. He left no clear heir. His wife Roxana was pregnant, but the child was not yet born. Alexander's half-brother was mentally disabled and could not rule. His generals, the men who had conquered the world at his side, began to eye each other suspiciously. Each commanded loyal troops.
Each had ambitions.
The empire Alexander had taken a decade to build would take only a few years to tear apart. At first, Alexander's generals tried to hold the empire together. They appointed Alexander's half-brother Philip as a figurehead king, and when Roxana gave birth to a son, the baby was named Alexander IV and declared king alongside Philip. But real power lay with the generals. The most important were Perdiccas, who held a position similar to prime minister, Ptolemy, who took control of Egypt, Seleucus, who would eventually rule most of the Asian territories, and Antigonus, who controlled much of Asia Minor. Within 2 years of Alexander's death, These men were at war with each other. The period from 322 to 281 BCE is known as the Wars of the Diadochi, which means the Wars of the Successors. It was a complex, shifting conflict with constantly changing alliances and betrayals. Armies marched back and forth across the lands Alexander had conquered. Cities changed hands multiple times. The dream of a united empire stretching from Greece to India slowly died. Perdiccas was murdered by his own officers in 321 BCE. The figurehead, King Philip, was killed in 317 BCE. Young Alexander IV and his mother, Roxana, were murdered around 310 BCE, ending Alexander's bloodline. One by one, the old generation of generals died or were killed. A new generation rose to replace them, equally hungry for power. By 301 BCE, at the Battle of Ipsus, the last attempt to hold Alexander's empire together was defeated. The empire was permanently divided into several kingdoms. In Egypt, Ptolemy and his descendants would rule for 3 centuries, the last of them being the famous Cleopatra. In Syria and Mesopotamia, Seleucus founded a dynasty that controlled much of the old Persian heartland. In Macedon and Greece, the Antigonid dynasty held power. Smaller kingdoms emerged in other regions, but what of Persia itself, the land that had been the center of the great empire for 2 centuries? The eastern provinces of Alexander's empire, including much of Iran and Central Asia, fell under the control of the Seleucid dynasty. The Seleucid kings ruled from Syria and tried to maintain control over these vast eastern territories. They founded Greek cities and encouraged Greek settlement. The culture of these regions became a blend of Greek and Persian elements, creating what historians call the Hellenistic civilization. However, the Seleucids never controlled their eastern provinces as effectively as the Persian kings had done. The distances were too great, the resources too stretched. Local rulers in distant provinces enjoyed considerable independence. The old Persian nobility, while no longer ruling an empire, maintained their wealth and influence. They preserved Persian language, customs, and traditions, even under Greek overlords. In the mid-3rd century BCE, a new power emerged from the northeast of Iran. The Parthians were originally a nomadic people from the steppes beyond the empire's borders. Around 247 BCE, under a leader named Xerxes, they established an independent kingdom in the region called Parthia. At first, the Seleucids paid little attention to this development. They had problems elsewhere, fighting wars with Egypt and dealing with rebellions in other provinces. But the Parthians slowly expanded their territory. They moved west and south into the Iranian plateau. They adopted many Persian customs and presented themselves as the heirs of the old Persian Empire. The Parthian nobles wore Persian-style clothing, practiced Persian court rituals, and claimed to be restoring the glory of the ancient kings. In reality, the Parthian state was quite different from the old Persian Empire. It was more decentralized, with powerful noble families holding significant independent power. But the connection to the Persian past gave the Parthians legitimacy. In the 140s BCE, the Parthian king Mithridates I took advantage of Seleucid weakness to conquer Mesopotamia, including the great city of Babylon. By 129 BCE, the Parthians controlled all the lands that had once been the Persian heartland. The Seleucids were pushed back to Syria and would never recover their eastern territories. A new empire, rooted in Persian soil and claiming Persian heritage, now stood where the old Persian Empire had been. The Parthian Empire would prove remarkably durable. For nearly 5 centuries, it controlled the region between the Mediterranean and India. It became Rome's great rival in the east. Roman armies would invade Parthian territory multiple times over the centuries, sometimes winning great victories, but never achieving lasting conquest. The Parthians were masters of cavalry warfare, particularly the famous Parthian shot, where mounted archers would turn in their saddles and shoot backward as they retreated, devastating pursuing enemies. The Parthian period saw a revival of Persian culture after the Greek domination of the Hellenistic era. The Persian language, which had survived but been overshadowed by Greek, became more prominent again. Zoroastrianism, which had been one religion among many under the Seleucids, regained importance. Persian artistic styles re-emerged, blending with Greek influences to create something unique. Trade flourished under Parthian rule. The Parthian Empire sat astride the Silk Road, the network of trade routes connecting China with the Mediterranean world. Caravans carried silk from China, spices from India, and luxuries from throughout Asia westward. Gold and silver, glass and wine, and other goods traveled east. The Parthian kings grew wealthy from taxes on this trade. However, the Parthian Empire was not as centralized as the old Persian Empire had been. The Parthian kings ruled through powerful noble families who controlled their own territories and armies. This system worked well when the king was strong and the nobles cooperated, but it led to instability when succession disputes arose or when nobles fought among themselves. Civil wars periodically weakened the empire. In the early 3rd century CE, the Parthian Empire was racked by internal conflicts. The king Artabanus Farful faced a rebellion from one of his vassals, a minor ruler named Ardashir, from the province of Fars in southern Iran. Fars was the ancient homeland of the Persians, the region from which Cyrus the Great had come nearly 1,000 years earlier. Ardashir claimed descent from the ancient Persian kings and said he was restoring the legitimate Persian monarchy. In 224 CE, Ardashir defeated and killed Artabanus IV in battle. He then spent 2 years conquering the rest of the Parthian territories. In 226 CE, he crowned himself King of Kings, taking the ancient title of the Persian emperors. He founded a new dynasty, the Sasanian dynasty, named after his grandfather, Sasan. The Parthian Empire was over. A new Persian Empire had begun. The Sasanian Empire that Ardashir founded would be the last great Persian empire of the ancient world. For over 4 centuries, from 224 to 651 CE, the Sasanians ruled much of the Middle East and Central Asia. In many ways, they deliberately modeled themselves on the Achaemenid Persians who had ruled 1,000 years before. They saw themselves as restoring ancient Persian glory after centuries of foreign rule and Parthian decentralization. Ardashir and his successors created a much more centralized state than the Parthians had maintained. They reduced the power of the old noble families and expanded the role of the central government. They reorganized the army, creating a strong force of heavy cavalry called cataphracts, armored horsemen who were nearly invulnerable to enemy arrows and spears. They reformed the tax system and the administration of the provinces. The Sasanians made Zoroastrianism the official state religion. The Zoroastrian priesthood gained significant power and wealth. Fire temples were built throughout the empire, and the religion's sacred texts were collected and written down in an official version. Other religions were tolerated but faced restrictions. There were Christian, Jewish, and Buddhist communities within the empire, and generally they were allowed to practice their faiths. But they were definitely second class compared to Zoroastrians. Ardashir's son, Shapur I, who ruled from 240 to 270, was one of the most successful Sasanian kings. He expanded the empire eastward and westward. His greatest triumph came in 260 CE when he defeated and captured the Roman Emperor Valerian in battle. This was an unprecedented humiliation for Rome. A Roman emperor had never been captured by an enemy before. Shapur commemorated this victory in elaborate rock carvings that still exist today, showing the Roman emperor kneeling before the Persian king. The Sasanian Empire and the Roman Empire, later the Byzantine Empire, would be locked in conflict for most of the Sasanian period. The border between them ran through Mesopotamia and Syria, and control of this region shifted back and forth. Sometimes Persia would win major victories and push deep into Roman territory. At other times, Rome would strike back. Neither side could achieve a decisive, permanent victory. The wars drained the resources of both empires, but neither would back down. Each saw the other as their only equal and their greatest threat. In the late 4th and early 5th centuries, Persia faced a serious threat from the east. The Hephthalites, called the White Huns, invaded from Central Asia. These fierce nomadic warriors conquered the eastern provinces of the Sasanian Empire and threatened the heartland of Persia. The Sasanian king Peroz was killed fighting them in 484 CE. For several decades, the Sasanians paid tribute to the Hephthalites, a humiliating situation for the proud Persian Empire. King Kavad III and his son Khosrow Baya, who ruled in the early and mid-6th century, restored Sasanian power. Khosrowit, called Anushirvan, meaning the immortal soul, is remembered as one of the greatest Sasanian kings. He allied with the Turks, another nomadic people, and together they destroyed the Hephthalite kingdom around 560 CE. The eastern frontier was secured. Khosrow then turned his attention to reform at home. Khosrow reorganized the tax system to make it fairer and more efficient. He reformed the army, creating 4 regional commands instead of a single commander who might become too powerful. He encouraged learning and scholarship. Greek philosophical and scientific texts were translated into Persian. Scholars from India brought mathematical knowledge. The court at Ctesiphon, the Sasanian capital, became a center of learning. Khosrow also fought several wars with Byzantium, the Eastern Roman Empire. These conflicts were expensive but generally successful for Persia. Khosrow captured the great city of Antioch and deported its population to a new city near Ctesiphon. The wealth plundered from Roman territory paid for his reforms and building projects. Under Khosrow, the Sasanian Empire reached perhaps its peak of power and prosperity. After Khosrow died in 579 CE, his son Hormizd had a troubled reign. He was overthrown in 590 CE by a rebellion led by one of his generals, Bahram Chobin. Hormizd's son Khosrow II fled to Byzantine territory and asked the Byzantine emperor for help. The Byzantines restored Khosrow II to the throne in exchange for territorial concessions. This intervention by Byzantium in Persian affairs planted seeds of resentment. Khosrow II, despite owing his throne to Byzantium, spent much of his reign at war with the Byzantines. When the Byzantine emperor Maurice was overthrown and murdered in 602 CE, Khosrow used it as an excuse to invade, claiming he was avenging his benefactor. The war that followed was initially a stunning success for Persia. By 622 CE, Persian armies controlled Syria, Palestine, Egypt, and much of Asia Minor. Jerusalem fell to the Persians, and the True Cross, Christianity's most sacred relic, was carried back to Persia as a trophy. For a brief moment, it seemed the Sasanians had achieved what Xerxes had failed to do 1,000 years earlier. They had conquered a huge portion of their western rivals' territory. The Mediterranean world appeared to be falling under Persian control, but the Byzantine Empire was not finished. In 622 CE, the Byzantine emperor Heraclius launched a desperate counterattack. Heraclius invaded Persian territory from the north, striking directly toward the Persian heartland. His small, mobile army avoided the large Persian forces in the west and struck at Persia itself. Year after year, Heraclius campaigned deep in Persian territory, defeating every army sent against him. By 627 CE, he was approaching the capital Ctesiphon. Khosrow II's generals turned against him, blaming him for the disasters. He was overthrown and murdered. The new Persian king sued for peace. All the territories conquered over the previous 20 years were returned. The True Cross was sent back to Jerusalem. The long war had achieved nothing except to exhaust both empires. The Byzantine Empire was financially ruined and militarily depleted. The Sasanian Empire was equally weakened, with its prestige damaged and its treasury empty. The political situation in Persia was unstable, with multiple claimants to the throne and nobles fighting for power. Neither empire had any idea that their long struggle had opened the door for a completely new power. To the south, in the deserts of Arabia, a religious and political revolution was underway. The Prophet Muhammad had united the Arab tribes under the banner of a new religion, Islam. In 632 CE, the year Muhammad died, the Arabs began to expand beyond Arabia. The first target was the territory on the borders of the two exhausted empires. The Arab armies that invaded Persian and Byzantine territory in the 630s were not large, but they were united, motivated and led by skilled commanders. The Persian and Byzantine armies were weary from their long war with each other. In 636 CE, at the Battle of Al-Qadisiyah, an Arab army defeated a much larger Persian force. The western provinces of the Sasanian Empire quickly fell to the Arabs. The Sasanian king Yazdegerd III tried to rally resistance, but the empire was crumbling. In 642 CE, at the Battle of Nihavand, the main Persian army was destroyed. Yazdegerd fled east, trying to raise new forces, but the eastern provinces fell one by one. Nobles who had fought each other for control of the empire now submitted to the Arab conquerors or fled to Central Asia or India. In 651 CE, Yazdegerd was murdered by one of his own subjects while fleeing through northeastern Iran. With Yazdegerd's death, the Sasanian Empire ended. The last great Persian empire of antiquity was gone. The lands that had been the center of Persian civilization for over 1,000 years, since the time of Cyrus the Great, now became part of the rapidly expanding Islamic Caliphate. It seemed that Persian culture and identity might be swallowed up entirely by the Arab conquerors. But the story of Persian civilization did not end in 651 CE. The Arabs conquered the Persian Empire, but in many ways, Persian culture conquered the Arabs. The new Islamic Empire needed administrators who knew how to run a vast, complex state. They found those administrators among the educated Persians. The Arabs needed sophisticated bureaucratic systems, and they adopted the Persian systems. The Islamic Caliphate's government was heavily influenced by Persian models of administration. The Persian language survived and eventually flourished again. While Arabic became the language of religion and initially of government, Persian remained the language of culture and literature. By the 9th and 10th centuries, a new Persian literature was emerging, written in the Persian language, but using the Arabic script and incorporating Islamic themes. The great Persian poet Ferdowsi wrote the Shahnameh, the Book of Kings, an epic poem telling the legendary and historical past of Persia from creation to the Arab conquest. This work helped preserve Persian identity and historical memory. Persians played crucial roles in the Islamic Golden Age. Many of the greatest scholars, scientists, poets, and philosophers of medieval Islamic civilization were Persian. The scientist and philosopher Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna, was Persian. The mathematician Al-Khwarizmi, whose name gave us the word algorithm, was from the Persian cultural sphere. The poet Rumi, whose works are still read and loved today, wrote in Persian. Various Persian dynasties emerged within the Islamic world, ruling regional kingdoms. The Samanids in Central Asia, the Buyids in Western Iran and Iraq, and later the Safavids, who made Shia Islam the official religion of Iran, all maintained Persian cultural identity while being part of the larger Islamic world. Iran, the modern name for Persia, eventually emerged as a distinct nation with its own identity, shaped by its ancient heritage, its Islamic faith, and its unique Persian culture. The Persian empires of antiquity, from Cyrus's conquest to the fall of the Sasanians, span over 100-200 years of history. In that long sweep of time, the Persians created systems of government that influenced countless later empires. They demonstrated that an empire could be held together by tolerance and good administration, not just military force. They built roads and established trade routes that connected distant parts of the world. They created a sophisticated culture that valued art, poetry, and learning. When you think of ancient empires, you might first think of Rome or perhaps Egypt. But the Persian Empire was larger than Rome at its peak. It lasted longer than the Western Roman Empire. It influenced a vast region stretching from the Mediterranean to India. The legacy of those ancient Persian kings, from Cyrus the merciful conqueror to Darius the administrator to Khosrow the patron of learning, still echoes in the modern world. The ruins of Persepolis still stand in southern Iran, columns rising against the sky covered with carvings of tribute bearers from across the ancient world. The tomb of Cyrus still sits in the Iranian countryside, simple and dignified. These monuments are reminders of a time when Persian kings ruled the world, when the Persian Empire was the center of civilization, when to be Persian meant to be part of the greatest power on earth. And now, as we come to the end of this long journey through Persian history, let your mind rest. Let the images of ancient palaces and marching armies fade into the peaceful darkness of sleep. The story is told. The great empire has risen and fallen, but its memory endures. Close your eyes and drift away. And perhaps in your dreams you'll walk through the halls of Persepolis, or ride with Cyrus across the plains of Asia, or stand on the walls of Babylon, watching history unfold. Sleep well, and thank you for joining us on this journey through time. Until next time, this is the Historian's Tome, wishing you peaceful rest and pleasant dreams.